Hey everybody, and welcome back. Starting off here with lecture number 4 for Unit 3. Last time we talked about the Silurian and the Devonian periods of the Paleozoic era, and one of the things we alluded to was the transition of life from the marine setting, from the oceans and ponds and so on, into or onto the terrestrial landscape, pretty much how we got life on land. So I figured today would be a good time to just kind of cover in those series of adaptations together, because we're looking at not only vertebrates like ourselves, but also plants and arthropods. So we want to look at the stages at which life moved on to land throughout the Paleozoic. The three things that we're going to really talk about today are terrestrial plant diversification, so how plants diversified on land, and then following that, how arthropods and insects, the first animals on land, how they made that diversification and transition, and then finally we'll close up talking about vertebrates, so how we go from a fish to a tetrapod amphibian. It's not easy to do this. It's not easy to just go from a marine setting onto land. So, for example, here we have images of the modern day mud skipper. This is a small fish that can actually walk around on land for a while, and we think that a lot of the adaptations that modern day mud skippers have are also things that some of these early terrestrial tetrapods would have had. So we can study modern day animals that kind of live in these two worlds and get an idea of how these organisms did so in the past. So there's a couple of things that organisms need to overcome in order to move from an aquatic environment to a terrestrial one. Desiccation is the biggest one. Desiccation is drying out. Okay, so if you live in the water all the time, you're adapted to being completely contained and surrounded by an aqueous medium, by water. But when you get out on land, it's very, very easy to dry out. So plants and animals have adapted different characteristics to keep water inside your body, because that's a very, very important thing to do. Think how quickly somebody can get very sick or die from dehydration. And we're pretty well adapted to keeping water in our bodies, but plants and other kind of animals have to overcome these challenges as well. Feeding. So imagine, something like a fish getting food. They swim around and they actually just open their mouths. If you ever watch a fish eat, if you ever go fishing and you've got your worm on a hook in the water and you see the fish swim up to it, they don't like come swimming at it with their mouth wide open. They get up close to it and then open their mouth really rapidly, and that creates a suction that pulls the food in. Notice we don't do that on land. You really shouldn't go up to your meal and literally try to inhale it. That's not that's not a good idea. Don't do that. Plants, however, they obtain their nutrients, their food, through their root systems. So organisms in general, plants and animals, had to develop these new ways of getting nutrients, of getting food, when you're going from an aquatic environment to a terrestrial one. And part of that is locomotion, how you move around. Now, this isn't really an issue for plants, obviously, but for animals, both arthropods and vertebrates, adaptations for how you actually move on land are very different than in the water. Think about it. Underwater, you don't weigh as much. You're buoyant. On land, it's a different atmosphere. You're at, by definition, one atmosphere. So weight is different. So holding your body up and moving around requires some adaptations to an exoskeleton as well as an internal skeleton. Respiration and breathing. Again, plants have a different way of doing this, but when you look at vertebrates and arthropods, how we breathe is different. Now, fish will have oxygen exchange with their gills, so they just pretty much swim around and they're essentially breathing. We actually have to develop this pumping mechanism to pull air into our bodies. We do the gas exchange and then exhale. And different animals have found different ways of doing that, but it's still a major new type of series of adaptations. Reproduction's a big one. Plants reproduce through things like seeds and pollen and spores, where a lot of times it's very I guess I want to say indirect, right? So they'll just cast out all of these reproductive materials, whether it's pollen or seeds, and they just hope that things work out. So that's the way plants do it. But if you look at how fish reproduce, the female lays a bunch of eggs, the male releases a bunch of sperm, and it mixes in the water. Good reason why you shouldn't drink seawater. And that is what you make to get little baby fish. On land, we actually have to overcome some of those things. So one of the earliest adaptations is the production of the egg, like the amniote egg, because an egg is a self-contained little micro pond, right? It's got water in there. There's allowing a permeable membrane to allow for a gas exchange, and the organism is allowed to gestate and develop further, and then finally hatches out of the egg. So the evolution of the egg is one of these big challenges for living on land. So life didn't move onto land all at once. It happened in a series of stages that, when we look back, they actually make a lot of sense. The very first organisms to, I don't want to say set foot on land, but get on land were prokaryotic organisms, single-celled, simple organisms, probably in the Proterozoic. So we had things like algae, and other kind of microbes that probably were worked into soils. And this is how we have a lot of evidence for that, is actually in these fossilized soils. You get a soil by having microorganisms break down rock. So if you have a fossilized soil, that tells you you had organisms, at least microorganisms, on land. Probably not in the cratonic interior, though. Most of these organisms probably stuck around more to the coastlines where it was still pretty moist. Plants, the very simple, primitive plants, first appear on land in the Ordovician, mostly in the form of small spores, and then we start seeing them advance more in the Silurian, and we're going to talk about that today. Invertebrates, things like spiders and scorpions, first came onto land in the late Ordovician, definitely early Silurian. We see lower Silurian systems with fossilized invertebrates. So technically the first animals on land were arthropods. And then finally, vertebrates in the Silurian and the Devonian. So if you look at the pattern here, we go from microbes to plants to arthropods to vertebrates, and there's a bit of a food chain here. Okay, the first thing we get on land are single-celled organisms, and they're producing a soil. Later, now that we have a soil, we have plants utilizing that soil on land. Once you have plants, you have the arthropods utilizing the plants, and then vertebrates coming out on land to eat the arthropods. So it's a stepwise progression, not all at once, not all in the same way, for life moving onto land. So let's talk a bit about land plants, because land plants are a little different than what we see in the water, right? So if you ever get sushi and the little seaweed wrapper, that's an aquatic plant. That stuff behaves very, very differently. It can dry out and rehydrate, and it's still fine. But most of our vascular plants, the stuffs that, the kind of things we grow in our gardens and our grasses and trees and things, have very specialized tissues, which is why we call them vascular. They have a series of tubes that run through the structure of the plant. So in this image, you're looking at a cross section through a plant stem, and you can see all the little tiny pores in there. And here's an experiment you can do at home. You've probably done it in kindergarten, where if you take a glass of water and you add some food coloring to it, let's say blue or red, and you put a stalk of celery in there halfway and come back the next day, the entire stalk of celery, or a significant portion of it, is going to be dyed that color. And that's because of these special tissues that conduct water through the plant. So through capillary action, it'll pull water up and help disperse photosynthetic products and any kind of minerals and nutrients that the plant needs. So these early land plants that we see would have been things like ferns and club mosses, and later on we see that in conifers, gymnosperms, and flowering plants. So most of our plants today have these types of features. So where do we have evidence for this type of transition? A significant portion of the Silurian and Devonian fossils we have that indicate early plants and animals actually come from parts of North America, but also parts of Scotland and Greenland, England, and Wales. And that's because back in the early Devonian, as you can see in this image, the continent Laurussia, which at the time was made of North America, Greenland, Scotland, and England and Wales, was a pretty shallow environment. Now, remember, we still have the Acadian orogeny going on at this point. So a lot of the sediment that's shed off of those mountains are producing these muddy flats, and they were subaerially exposed. So they were exposed to the atmosphere. As a result, they turned red. They rusted, they oxidized. So we have a lot of our early Devonian sediments represented in the form of oxidized sandstones, siltstones, and shales. So one of the nicknames we have for the old assemblage of Laurussia is the old red sandstone continent. So when we look at our early Devonian facies today, a lot of them are shallow to terrestrial environment, shallow water to terrestrial, and that's where we find a lot of these organisms preserved. Again, our earliest Ordovician land plants were pretty much spores. They were very, very simple. They're very similar to a lot of our modern plant spores, but they're just fossilized in some of the cherts from the Ordovician. So we know that we had land plants, but we know that they weren't very abundant. One of the first well-preserved definitive land plants that we have in the fossil record is from the Silurian, and this is a fossil known as Cooksonia. They're pretty small, only about 10 to 20 centimeters high. They didn't have leaves, but the entire structure of the plant was covered in what we call a waxy cuticle. So if you pick up something like a bell pepper or even the leaves that you see on some flowers like roses, they have kind of a waxy feel to them, similar to a cactus or an aloe vera plant if you just don't poke yourself. That waxy coating that we see on lots and lots of fruits and vegetables and plants um, prevents water loss. So by evolving this kind of waxy coating over the plant, it keeps the water inside, so these things don't have to dehydrate. Early land plants like Cooksonia were definitely terrestrial, but they still probably spent a lot of time in marshy, swampy environments. It's not until much later that we start seeing plants developing in places where we're really far away from a major water source. But this is the first steps towards developing those characteristics. If we look a little closer at Cooksonia, we can see some of the other features. Since this thing didn't have leaves, what did it have? So instead of leaves, Cooksonia and other similar Silurian land plants actually would have a little cup-shaped structure at the end of their stems known as a sporangium. And this is where they would produce spores and would let wind blow them around, very similar to how certain trees use pollen and wind today. Um, so they would reproduce this way, and a sporangium would drift off into the wind and land in a wet environment and hopefully produce a new Cooksonia or a similar kind of plant. So it's a very effective way of reproducing. However, you're not really getting a lot of genetic exchange that way. So they're very, very simple, but it was pretty effective. So this is an artist's rendition of what an early Silurian distribution of Cooksonia would be. Notice they're living in kind of a rocky soil, right at the margin of the sea, and that's probably pretty accurate. So this is the equivalent of like an early, I don't want to say forest, but this is pretty much it for plant life in the early Silurian, but it's more than what we had before. Another pretty well-known Silurian land plant from Australia is known as Baragwanathia. These are a little bit larger and more complicated and complex than Cooksonia, and they were actually about a meter high, if not higher. One of the cool things about Baragwanathia is it's actually one of the first land plants to really have true leaves, except they were very, very small little what we call leaflets. Gave Baragwanathia kind of a bushy appearance. And the cool thing is the way the leaves are actually attached onto the plant are in these coil-like patterns or spiral patterns. So it's one of the first plants, and they actually would have looked more like pine needles, but very soft. So small little soft leaflets. So one of the first plants to actually have little solar panels, which is essentially what leaves are. So if we look at an example of an early terrestrial landscape, rather fibrous, small, shrubby plants with small leaves living in very marshy environments. There's actually some places today very similar to this that we can study to get a better idea of how these early terrestrial landscapes and biomes of plants may have looked. Along with that, we have some of our earliest land animals, which in this case are arthropods. They're a little bit different than a lot of the modern arthropods today, but they're arthropods nonetheless. We have common myriapods, which include millipedes and centipedes. Just in case anybody's curious, centipedes are carnivorous, millipedes are herbivorous. So one of the largest arthropods ever to live happened a few, maybe 50 to 100 million years after this time, and we're talking about a millipede the size of a surfboard, absolutely huge, but again, herbivorous. We also had spider-like arachnids. This spider-like organism here, you notice it has 10 legs, not just 8. It's called a trigonotarbid. And then also scorpions. Again, the earliest land animals were things like spiders, scorpions, and some of these little centipedes and millipedes. But remember, arthropods don't produce very good fossils. similar to plants. We have to rely on carbonization and very specific preservation conditions to get our fossil record. One such place is the Rhynie Chert in Scotland, and this is also where we can go to get an idea of what these early landscapes looked like, because these preserve not just insects but also plants. Now, the Rhynie Chert is, if you remember what a chert is when we talked about sedimentary rocks, it's a microcrystalline silica. So you have an aquatic environment that has enriched silica in the water, and it starts to precipitate out. So this is growing around some of the remains of plants and animals. When we actually look at what this environment was at the time, it's very similar to modern day Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone is known for having a series of hydrothermal vents underneath it because of the caldera, so it's volcanic. This is going to produce mineral-rich waters in those geysers, what we call sinters, which is like a buried warm body of magma that will spit out water occasionally. And the plants that grow in Yellowstone in these shallow water, mineral-rich ponds are very, very unique, and they're very similar to what we see in the Silurian and early Devonian. So if we want to get an idea what early landscapes looked like in the Silurian, we can look at some of these unique deposits around Yellowstone National Park. So for example, this area here is a really good example of what the Silurian would look like, and that's what we see today forming at Yellowstone. So the Rhynie Chert formed in a very similar way. In the image we see here, we have small bits of plant material preserved in that chert. We also have parts of arthropods, invertebrates being preserved in there as well. So someday, in the millions of years into the future, what is Yellowstone today will look like the Rhynie Chert. By the late Devonian, we actually have gone from having small plants to larger plants to actually having trees and forests, and our first plants that produce seeds. Now, a seed is kind of a cool adaptation because so far spores and pollen and things, all those need to be near a body of water, but a seed has everything compact inside, and a seed can dry out, and then you can plant it years later away from a water source, and you can get a plant sprouting out of it. So seeds, the evolution of seeds indicate that plants are evolving towards moving more landward, away from the shoreline. They're diversifying more into new kinds of environments. One of the first and best known Devonian trees is this one called Archaeopteris. Now, this isn't to be confused with the Jurassic bird Archaeopteryx. This is Archaeopteris. This looks kind of like a pine tree. It looks like a conifer or a Christmas tree, but actually if you look closely at the branches, they don't have needles like a modern day conifer does. These are actually ferns. So it's a rather bushy, fern-like tree that started to produce seeds. So Archaeopteris forests in the late Devonian still probably in pretty swampy environments, similar to modern day cypress forests today, where you find especially more in marshy environments. So during the middle and late Devonian, this is when we get the evolution of tetrapods, four-limbed animals, from lobe-finned fish. So now we're going to talk about vertebrates a little bit. Okay. And this is a pretty unique transition. It's a very famous one paleontologically. There's been a lot of research done on how fish evolved into terrestrial animals. So we're going to look at some of the big highlights from that today. But first, what is a tetrapod? It's a word that we're going to be using for a little while, so we should get a definition down. A tetrapod is defined as any vertebrate animal, so an animal with a backbone, that lives on land or had ancestors that lived on land. So whales and dolphins and porpoises, other cetaceans, we do count them as tetrapods, even though they don't live on land. They evolved from a land-dwelling animal that returned to the water. So tetrapods, as a group, tetrapoda, includes amphibians, so frogs, lizards, and salamanders. It includes reptiles, so amphibians, frogs, salamanders, and newts. Reptiles would be lizards and snakes and crocodiles and turtles. birds, also in reptilia, and then mammals. Those are all considered tetrapods. Notice fish are excluded from that. Okay, so if we look at this from an evolutionary tree, you can see that here we have chordata. Okay, that's every animal that has some kind of a notochord going down its back, such as a lamprey, but that also includes all vertebrates. Okay, so all vertebrates are chordates, but not all chordates are vertebrates, because lamprey are not vertebrates. So with vertebrates, we do have fish, but on the other branch, we have tetrapods. And tetrapods, again, include amphibians, synapsids, which are mammals and their reptiles, and then diapsids, which are their reptiles and birds and their ancestors. One thing you might notice here is most of the time tetrapods have walking legs. They usually have 4 of them. Tetra means 4. Pod is Latin for foot, so 4 feet. What about snakes and whales and legless amphibians? They are considered tetrapods because their ancestors had legs. When we look at the fossils of snakes and whales, we see legs, and those legs were lost later. They evolved away from them because of the new kind of lifestyle that they were living. So I'm a tetrapod, you're a tetrapod, your pet dog and cat is a tetrapod. Technically, your pet snake is a tetrapod. It's just kind of an odd one. So we're talking about fish essentially leaving the water. Now, why would they want to do that? Well, there's a couple of different views. The traditional one is to escape drying pools, that as sea levels were going down in the middle to late Paleozoic, there was an increased amount of competition as these pools were drying up, and so fish started taking new advantageous characteristics onto land. Obviously, going from one drying pool to another, fish would try it. Things like mud skippers and not would always be able to make it, but the ones that could would then pass down those robust genes to the next generation. It could also be that young ones left the ponds to avoid predation, because if you're in a big pond and there's a predator in there with you, as the pond gets smaller, that predator gets closer. So perhaps they left for that reason, or because there's this new food source on land in the form of arthropods and plants. It could be all of the above. So I want to talk about a handful of these different types of fish to tetrapod invertebrates. Now, this is not an exhaustive list of every kind of tetrapod and every kind of lobe-finned ripidestian fish, but we're going to look at some major ones that really outline the change. So we're going to start at the bottom of this evolutionary tree, going back to about 390 million years ago, perhaps. And what we're going to start with looking at is a true fish. And on the far left here, you can see a few characteristics. For example, this structure in the back. That's known as an operculum. Fish have these. It's the little plate of bone that's outlined in blue, and now I've just outlined it in yellow, that helps protect the gills. As we go into terrestrial vertebrates, they don't have that anymore. We don't have a bone protecting gills because we don't have gills anymore. The other thing to remember too is that your true fish really have more eyes on the outside of their head, right? If you look at a bass, if you look at a shark, their eyes are on the side. If you look at a terrestrial amphibian like a frog or a salamander, their eyes are on top of their head, so the head's flattened. They go from being round to being kind of flat on top. Okay, so that's a couple of characteristics that we're going to point out, but we're going to start with this first guy here, Eusthenopteron. So here's Eusthenopteron. It's a fish. It is a lobe-finned fish. It's a ripidestian from the Devonian. However, this is about as close as you can get to being a tetrapod without being a tetrapod. It is a fish, but it has bones in its lobe fins that are the primitive pre-versions of our shoulders, our hips, arms, and legs. So this is a starting point with true lobe-finned fish as we're starting to see them diversify into this more terrestrial form. As we move up the ladder, our next organism is Panderichthys. Panderichthys is also truly a fish. However, it does have in its back lobe fins, for example, a femur. It has a pelvis, and it also has a tibia and a fibula. So and then after that, it doesn't have fingers necessarily, but it still has these kind of lobe fins. But we're starting to see the first true bones of limbs, not just fins. Again, notice on Panderichthys too, the head is starting to go from being round to kind of flat with the eyes on top. This suggests Panderichthys was living in a shallow water environment and could probably peek its eyes up above the water, similar to how a frog does today, which means it may have been eating insects or anything that got close to the surface of the water. And then we get to this very, very famous fossil, Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik is one of the most important fossils that has been found probably in the last 50 years. It's a great example of understanding geology, stratigraphy, and facies and evolution. Tiktaalik is kind of the bridge between fish and terrestrial or somewhat terrestrial tetrapod. So when the paleontologists that discovered Tiktaalik went out into the Arctic to look for fossils, they knew what they were looking for. So they said, we want to find something that kind of fits in between these two worlds. We were looking for this transitionary fossil. Well, where should we look? And then they looked at some geologic maps and thought, well, this animal would be living in shallow water environments if it's a transitional life form. So where do we have Devonian age shallow water environments? I said, oh, up in the Arctic. We do have some of the red sandstones up there. Okay, and so they went up there. What would we be looking for? We'd be looking for the following characteristics. And after numerous field seasons, they actually found it. So this is why understanding facies and understanding geology and evolution and paleontology kind of come together. So what makes Tiktaalik so unique? Tiktaalik has a neck. It's a fish with a neck, technically. Okay. Now, most fish, if they want to turn around, they have to commit their entire body to turning around. But with Tiktaalik, you could actually look over his shoulder because he had a neck. He also had a shoulder. Some of the other features of Tiktaalik, again, the eyes are flat on top. Its forelimbs are pretty much forelimbs. It has a humerus, it has a pectoral girdle or a shoulder, it has a lower arm, it has a wrist, has a very important feature, it has a wrist, but it also has these bowed out ribs. If you look at a normal fish, the ribs are kind of straight underneath the body, but in this case they bow out, and one of the reasons for that is to have space for lungs. So we think Tiktaalik actually did breathe air. Probably didn't walk around on land much, but as you can see in this illustration, where it almost looks like it's just kind of like lounging in the water with half of its body out, that's what we think Tiktaalik probably did. It probably would eat animals and small arthropods that were in these shallow waters. So Tiktaalik was all vertebrate tetrapod in the front, and it was fish in the back. So it was really good at doing things like push-ups. Okay. So again, true neck, so it had increased mobility. This thing could turn its head very, very quickly, and it had more of a tetrapod front, fish-like back, and those bowing ribs, again, indicating that it was breathing air. When you have bowed out ribs, it indicates that there's space in there for lungs to inflate and deflate as it would breathe. So Tiktaalik is a very, very important fossil, and we'll have an extra credit project coming out here in the next few days that outlines more about Tiktaalik and its relatives. So Tiktaalik really is the bridge between these two worlds, and then we move up to our very first definitive tetrapod, which is Acanthostega. So Acanthostega is it's a true amphibian, and they were pretty big. They were about maybe 3-4 feet long, so that's big for a salamander. They lived in the late Devonian of Greenland, and they have definitive limbs, forelimbs, back limbs. They don't have fins. They actually have fingers and wrists and ankles. However, it still probably spent most of its time, if not all of its time, in the water, similar to modern day amphibians as well. Salamanders can walk on land, but they usually stay in the water. So this is a very well-known and well-represented early tetrapod. And you can see those incremental steps going from something like Panderichthys to Tiktaalik to Acanthostega, and see those little characteristics change from one species to the next. And then we get up to our next and final organism we're going to talk about, which is Ichthyostega. Ichthyostega is not only an early tetrapod, but it's also one of the largest of these early tetrapods. It lived at the same time as Acanthostega, except this one was much larger. Um, Not as aquatic. We actually think, looking at its shoulder blade, notice how huge this shoulder blade is on Acanthostega and how big the pelvis is. When you have a large pelvis and a large shoulder blade, that's a large surface area for muscles to attach to. So the bigger the muscles, that means they were actually using them. You don't need these in the water, you need them on land. So we think that Ichthyostega was able to walk around on land. It still probably spent a lot of time in the water. We think it probably filled a similar niche to a seal. They probably lived in the water, but they could flop around on land pretty easily. And again, they get pretty big. Ichthyostega can get 6 feet long. They can get pretty large. So here are some fossils of Ichthyostega. Again, the hand and the foot, very well detailed. You can count the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 digits, just like you'd see on modern tetrapods like you and me today. So that kind of concludes what we're going to be looking at for our transition from aquatic life to terrestrial life. And we're going to see next time how these organisms really start to diversify in the very late part of the Paleozoic, known as the Carboniferous, which is made of 2 periods, the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian. Call it the Carboniferous. And this is when arthropods got huge and amphibians diversified, and ultimately we start seeing the evolution of reptiles as we start to bring the Paleozoic to a close. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me or reach out. Hope everybody's doing well, and we'll talk to you next time.